we're going to be talking about now is the materials that are used by artists and some of the different kind of effects that are achieved by these different materials. So we're going to start with what is called two-dimensional art. And say that what I mean by that is it has height and width, but it has no depth. So in other words, we're talking about things like paintings and drawings. We're going to also talk about print making and the prints that are created in printmaking. And so that's what I'm talking about. And so the chapters that you should look at for this two-dimensional art that we're first going to talk about are chapters 6, 7, and 8, which cover drawing, painting, and printmaking. There are some other chapters that we're not going to cover that are also two-dimensional art. Photography, for example, is considered to be a two-dimensional art. Graphic design, for the most part, is two-dimensional also, although graphic designers also design containers for things, and so that's a more three-dimensional sort of art. So what we're going to be concentrating on are just drawing, painting, and printmaking. And so in other words, height and width are the major dimensions for two-dimensional art that we're going to be talking about. And we're going to start by talking about drawing because it's really the basic art. Even sculptors who create three-dimensional art have to learn to draw because they often sketch out their ideas on a piece of paper first before they then begin to try and work them into three-dimensional form. Architects who design buildings, which are three-dimensional also, usually draw out their plans and their ideas on paper also. So drawing is a very basic type of art that all other artists use, even though they may not specialize just in drawing. And we're going to talk about some different purposes that drawings have served over the history of art. But before we do that, I want to talk to you about some terms that we're going to be using in class here and define them for you. We use the word medium, or the plural of it is media, M-E-D-I-A. And what medium or media means, it's the material that the artist uses. It's the actual material thing that the artist uses to express their ideas. So that's what we use, what we mean by the term medium. Every material has its own characteristics, has certain things that an artist can accomplish by using that particular material. And so artists have to work with those limitations on the materials, or they have to figure out some way of trying to expand on those limitations, and often artists do that. Sometimes those, that expansion is successful, sometimes it isn't. Leonardo da Vinci, for example, in The Last Supper that he painted, that everybody is usually familiar with, he painted it on a wall, and so there was a certain material that was used during the Renaissance when he painted that to paint paintings on walls. But he didn't like the effects of that material. He thought it limited him too much. And so he tried to mix other materials with this medium that was used for wall painting, and it didn't work. And so even before Leonardo died, the paint was already flaking off of the wall of the painting of the Last Supper. So, there are limitations that artists have to be aware of, and sometimes they can experiment and try to push them a little bit further, but it isn't always successful. Then technique is another term that's often used, and what that means, it means the personal way an artist uses the materials, the medium that he's working with. For example, Jackson Pollock, we've talked about him. He's the one that did those drip paintings, and I described, how he would sort of dance around the canvas. He would put the canvas on the floor, and then he'd take a can of paint and he'd just sort of drip and splash it around the canvas. So that would be his technique. But that's a different technique from the technique that Leonardo would have used in painting. He would have used a brush, to apply paint very carefully to a canvas. So when we're talking about technique, we're just talking about the particular way that an artist uses the medium or the materials that he uses. And, the technique is just a means to an end. It's a means to put that material in some form so that we can look at it. Then the third term that you see there is support. And the word support means the surface that the artist works on. For drawing, the surface is usually paper. Parchment has also been used. Actually, walls have been used. Cave paintings are often called drawings that were made, by prehistoric people. So the support is the term that's used to refer to whatever surface the artist is working on. Pigment is the term that refers to the color in the material. It's powdered mineral usually, particularly in the past. Nowadays it's manufactured. It's still really minerals and various chemicals, mixed together to form the pigment. And what pigment does, it supplies the color to the medium. So that's what pigment is. Then neutral is a term, and I've mentioned this before, that's simply the term that artists use to refer to black, gray, and white. Artists don't think of black and gray and white as being color. And so they differentiate between the neutrals and the hues or the color, that's being used by an artist. Binder is the material, is some kind of substance that holds the pigment together so that you can apply it to a surface. And binders are very important, and actually they're often used to define the type of medium that you're looking at. For example, in oil painting, the binder is oil. It's linseed oil. And the pigment is mixed with that linseed oil, and then that oil, since it's a liquid, allows the painter to apply the pigment to a surface. So we'll be talking about binders, different kinds of substances that are used. Now, in drawing, the different materials are divided up into two different types, either dry media, and on your handout that I gave you, on one side there's a table of the different kind of materials used in drawing, and the other side has a table of painting materials on it. And I listed on the table for drawings the materials that are called dry media. And dry media are exactly what it means. They're not liquid. They're dry, and the way that they're applied to a surface is by scratching that surface with the material. Usually the material's in the form of a stick or a rod of, whatever it is, whatever particular media it is. So dry media is applied by scratching the surface and leaving behind, some of that material. Wet media means it's a liquid. And as we're going to see with drawing, the only liquid in drawing is ink. And it applies, it goes on much more smoothly. You don't have to really, scratch the surface, and so you don't get little clumps of material. You get a very smooth flow of the ink on the surface. Now, in drawing, there are also a couple of other terms I need to define. The texture of the paper is very important, or the surface, the support that's used in drawing. And we refer to that texture as the grain of the paper. And that can vary. You can have a piece of paper that's very smooth, almost like the pieces of paper that you have in your notebook or like what I hand out here in class. You can also have paper that feels very rough to the touch. And if you could look at it very closely, you would see that there are places where that paper is raised from this flat sort of surface. And the grain is very important in drawing because with the dry media, the way that dry media sticks to the surface or is attached to the surface is sometimes the grain. The grain captures, as you're scratching across that surface, it captures some of that material. And then finally, a fixative is any kind of material. In art, there are particular chemical mixtures that are made that are used to spray on the surface to protect that surface of the drawing after the drawing has been made. Because in the dry media, there's no soaking into the paper, so it's all on that surface, where it's been scratched on. And if you touch it with your fingers, you can smudge it. You can wipe it off. And so after the drawing is completed, people who draw usually spray a fixative on that surface, which covers the drawing with an invisible layer, that just protects that drawing from being rubbed off. And also, it usually protects the drawing against light. If you've ever been to a museum, oftentimes they won't let you take photographs, particularly flash photographs. And the reason is that with some of these materials, if hundreds of people that come through every day would take a flash photograph of the work, it would bleach it out. And so the fixative helps to prevent that, but it doesn't prevent it entirely. So that's why they'll always tell you, no flashes in the museum. So before we get to talking and just going through very quickly the different materials that are used, I want to talk a little bit about what drawings are like. Drawings are really one of the first things that children do. Even children, before they can write words and before they know language, they often communicate by drawing a picture of something. And so it's a way of visual communication. It's one that all people begin to use very quickly. And then, as you develop into school, some people continue to use, drawings as a way of communicating, but most people, begin to use words in writing or verbally in order to communicate. Drawing also is a way of visualizing things, of really putting down in some visual form ideas or objects that you want to communicate to somebody else. It helps to train the artist's eye, and so that's one reason that all artists are taught to draw, because it really forces you to look carefully at all the details. And so again, it goes back to that selective perception that we talked about. This is one way that artists really train their eye to see everything by going through drawing classes and learning how to draw. Because drawings, tend to be just black and white for the most part, not entirely, and they tend to be smaller because paper used to be produced only in small size. It means that you have to get closer. I'm going to have to turn this off because it keeps coming on here. Okay. Because the paper is smaller and you're only using black and white, usually people have to get closer in order to see a drawing and to really see the details of the drawing. So often people refer to drawings as being intimate, meaning that you do, create a very close relationship with a drawing because you have to get so close to it. And so that's one of the terms that's often used for drawing. Also, because drawings do not have to take a lot of time in order to create an image that you can understand, people often refer to drawings as being spontaneous or being immediate because you don't have many layers of preparation that you have to go through to do a drawing. You just take a piece of paper and you can start drawing on it. So it has that immediacy. And some people like that. They like the immediacy, they like the intimacy of drawing. And so that's just part of, what the nature of drawing really is. But, in recent years, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the discussion also, modern paper can be produced in very large rolls now. And so now you can have very large works like you're seeing here. Here is the artist right here who is touching up one of these drawings that he's made of Abraham Lincoln. And so it gives you a sense of scale. These are very large scale drawings. And so with modern developments and being able to develop very large pieces of paper, it has changed, some of that intimacy. Things don't have to be so small and you have to get up really close in order to see them. You can see them from very far away nowadays. Here is an example of, some of that sense of immediacy that you get. This is the self-portrait of Katja Kollwitz. We've looked at it before. I talked about it in terms of gestural line, one type of line that can be used in art. And here, because she didn't describe, she describes sort of the movement of her arm and her hand by these zigzagging lines that you see here, it sort of gives you that sense of immediacy. I mean, it's almost as if you actually saw her make, that line. It looks so quick. It looks so immediate. It has that spontaneity about it. And so that's one thing that many people value about drawings, that you don't have this very labored kind of appearance where it took months or years maybe for an artist to make that work. Here you get that sense that she just did this really quickly and was able to get across an emotion and a feeling in just very quick lines like she did here. So this gives you an example of what is valued by some people in terms of drawing, that immediacy that you get. I brought in just, for comparison, a drawing that was made for this painting that you see here. The painting is an oil painting, and here is a sketch that he made prior to creating this oil painting. Notice that he's given most of the detail, most of the time to the face. The lines are darker here. He's described the hairdo and the features of the face very carefully. Whereas with the rest of the body, the lines are much lighter. He really wasn't as concerned with the rest of the body as he was with really getting that face. This was a commission that this artist received from this woman. And it was for her portrait, and so naturally he's concerned to make sure that it looks like her. And so he spends most of his time, with the face. But, just with simple pencil drawing, and this is not the kind of pencil you use. We'll talk about the material in a minute here. Just using a pencil, he's able to really sketch out, the conformation of her body, and then to give us all the details of her face. And we feel like, we know what she looks like, with this very quick sort of sketch that he makes. And actually, many people like the fact that in a drawing, something's left to your imagination. In the drawing here, he hasn't told you what color her gown is. He hasn't given you all the details of her gown. All the ruffles and, the puckers that are put in her sleeves here that you see in the painting. He hasn't described everything in the background. In other words, he's left something up to you, to think about and to sort of add in. Whereas with the painting, it's all done for you. There's really nothing more that you have to put into that. And some people, and it's personal preference, some people like the more detailed drawing where everything is given to you and where you really get a sense of the historical period of time, not in the drawing but the painting. And others like the drawing because, it allows you to fill it in. And if you want to put her in a slightly different period of time, you can because he hasn't given all that much detail to it. So, some people enjoy drawings and like drawings much better than paintings. I happen to like color, and so I tend to like paintings rather than drawings. So, and then here just shows you again just another case of using, some of these drawing materials and gaining, very different kinds of effects. Here in the woman on the right, and this again is by Katja Kollwitz. She's described a lot of the detail of the flesh, of the woman, the anatomy of this woman who's clutching this dead child in her arms. Whereas this artist here, a 20th century artist, he's leaving, again, a lot of what this person looks like to the imagination, and maybe even, asking us to question a little bit about why did he create this smudge over here on this side? Did it mean the man didn't have an eye, or is he trying to suggest something about the character of the man, that maybe he was a little mysterious or sinister, or, however you might want to interpret it. So you can get, a very carefully detailed kind of effect. You can get a very spontaneous effect. When you're looking at drawings, the primary things that you have to look at usually are simply line. How is line treated? Is it controlled very carefully and used to outline the form as you see here? Or is it allowed to sort of express some of the emotion of the artist? And so it has this more sketchy quality. Then another visual element that is usually very important to drawing is value, that lightness or darkness of things that we talked about. And here, the values are used to just emphasize the naturalism of the treatment of the body that we see here with this woman. Whereas here, the value really emphasizes the emotion. So in a drawing, you primarily have line, describing shape, light being used in some manner, and that's what you have. You can have background. If someone is trying to create a very naturalistic scene in a drawing, then they will give you background, and so you might have space that you could analyze too. But really in a drawing, the primary things that are most important to a drawing are line, the way it's treated, how it describes form, and then light, the values of light and shade that are created in a work of art. So I want to just give you an indication of the way that drawings have been used, mostly in Western art. And so first of all, drawings in the past were thought of as sketches. Drawings were not thought of in Europe or the United States as complete works of art until the 19th century. Up until that point, the only reason an artist created a drawing was in preparation for some other medium. For example, we're looking here on the right at one of the figures from the Sistine Chapel that Michelangelo did. Over here, we're looking at a drawing that he made in preparation for creating the figure in paint. And you can see that, here he's described the underlying musculature of this woman. There's no clothing. She might even look a little masculine to you because Michelangelo's women tend to look masculine. In his sculptures, sometimes it almost looks like he modeled a male form and then put just lumps on the front, for breasts at the last minute. The breasts sometimes don't even look like they go with the body. So, he's analyzed the whole body in terms of the musculature before he's put on the drapery. And you can, what are really nice about these studies, these preliminary drawings, is that you really see his mind working, and thinking, how exactly do I want to show this toe or this face or this hand? Here he has sketched the foot with his toe, and you can see he's worked on that toe several times to find exactly the right position that he wants. He's done the same thing with the shoulder here and the arm. He's repeated it right down here. Also the face. The hand, is repeated. And so often, what's nice about these drawings is that you really see somebody thinking. You don't just see the finished result, you see an artist really working through things and trying to figure things out. And I like that about drawings because I really like being able to see sort of how the artist has figured things out and worked it out, and finally created this final work. So I do like that about drawings, even though I tend to like paintings better than drawing. This kind of preliminary drawing that you see here is called a cartoon. In art, cartoons do not always mean the same thing they mean to us today. They're not something funny. They're not from a comic book or something like that. A cartoon means a preliminary drawing that's going to be used by an artist for some other medium. And he made a number of cartoons like this. And then he made one final cartoon when he had worked everything out about the way this woman was going to look, how she was going to be positioned in the painting, how every little part of her was going to look. He made one final drawing without all the little other details that you see here that showed her with the clothing on and everything exactly as she was going to look. And it was the same size as the painting was going to be. And then what Michelangelo did was, and he did it two different ways, he took the drawing up to the ceiling where he was painting, and for some of them he actually took a metal instrument and he actually inscribed all of the contours and all the major details of the form into the wall, and then took the cartoon down and then followed, those lines that he had created in painting the work. Another way that they transfer these cartoons to the surface, and Michelangelo used this way also, was that they put little pinpoints around all the major contours, the major details, and then they took the cartoon up to the surface and they took a bag of charcoal dust and they pounced, or they knocked it against all of those little holes. And so then when you took the cartoon down, you saw all these little dots, and then they connected the dots together. And so drawings have been used, for this preliminary sketch or cartoon, as you see here. And then in the 19th century and into the 20th century, they began to be used as a part of the works of art. For example, here, the way that the artist treated his paint, it's, with these black lines that you see here that describe the contours of the forms, the major parts of the details. It's almost as if he took black paint, oil paint, and used it like a drawing medium to sketch out or draw out the major forms, and then he filled it in with color. And so in that way, drawings have been used as part of another medium. Also, sometimes the artist actually draws on the surface with the materials that are used in drawing, pencil or charcoal, and then he paints over that, allowing sometimes some of that drawing to show through. So in one way or another, another purpose for drawings has been to be a part of another work of art and to actually show or be a part, be something expressive within that work of art. The first full, completed, finished drawings were made in the Far East and not in Europe or the United States. And they were made much earlier than they were made in Europe or the United States. By about the 11th century, finished drawings were being made in China, and this shows you one of them. Part of the reason that these drawings were made so early in China is that the same ink and the same brushes that are used to write with are also used for painting, and that isn't always the case. I've mentioned pencil as being one of the materials that's used in drawing, but it's not the lead pencil that everybody uses to write with. It's a different kind of pencil that we'll talk about. So that may be part of the reason why artists in the Far East, particularly in China and then later in Japan, were first at creating finished works of art that were drawings. And this artist created it using, brush and ink as the methods that he used to create this bamboo painting that we're looking at here. Another way that drawings have been used is as illustrations in books. Before the computer, any illustrations that were made by artists were made using drawing type materials. And so this illustration here of Maurice Sendak, he was a graphic designer as well as a writer, and he wrote Where the Wild Things Are. He actually used markers, colored markers, which are one of the kinds of drawing materials, in order to create this illustration of the strange animals that he describes in his book. So before the computer, nowadays things like this would be made on the computer and wouldn't be made by hand usually. But up until the computer was created, usually they were made by hand. And again, they were called illustrations or drawings. They're always classified as being drawings. So I want to talk to you just very briefly about the different kind of materials. And I gave you the chart. The dry media, the first ones we're going to talk about, these aren't the only ones, are chalk and charcoal and graphite. And here we have these two works that I've already mentioned. The one that you see of Katja is made with black chalk and charcoal. Charcoal, there are two different kinds of charcoal that I mentioned on your table there. There's one kind that's called stick or vine charcoal. And what that is wood that's put into an oven and baked until all that is left is just the carbon of that wood. And then that carbon is used to draw with. It's very delicate because it breaks easily, but it makes the finest lines, and it makes very rich, very velvety, dark lines. And so it's the kind that artists like to use. There is another kind that you can see in the store and buy in stores often, like in Walmart even, and that's called compressed charcoal. And what compressed charcoal is, again, it's the carbon, that's left after the wood is baked in the oven, burned off until all that's left is the charcoal. But then they grind it up and they compress it into sticks, squared sticks. And although it's the same material, the compression tends to make it a little harder to work with. You often don't get quite as rich darks and you can't work with it quite as delicately as you can with vine charcoal. So the artists like to use vine charcoal. Compressed charcoal is easier to work with for people that are just starting out because it doesn't break as easily. It doesn't crumble like the vine charcoal does. And so probably Katja here, in working with this work that you're looking at over here, used vine charcoal combined with chalk. And what chalk is, it's carbon also that has been mixed with a clay in order to hold it, to hold the carbon together. It's not the same kind of chalk that children use and that we sometimes draw on sidewalks with. It's a finer chalk than that, and at first, when it began to be used in the Renaissance, it was natural chalk. It was, found in nature, and very little was done to it. And it was very limited in color. There was only red, white, and a black chalk that were used in the Renaissance. But nowadays, we can manufacture all sorts of colors, and that's why we have all the colors of chalk today. And then this work over here was actually made with pencil that was then smudged. Most kids have used pencil, sometime in their lives, and I'm sure you probably have, where you took the side of a pencil and you could sort of smudge a line and create a darker sort of area. Again, the kind of pencil that we use is lead pencil. And the kind of pencil that is used in art is a graphite pencil. Again, it's a different kind of material than lead pencil, and so it gives a finer line. It gives more delicacy to it. You can get different hardnesses. It's a soft sort of carbon that is then compressed and formed into a roll and put inside a wood container, the outside of a pencil, which is wood. And they can vary the softness, so you can get some pencils that are very hard, and those kind of pencils are going to make very fine lines. You won't have big, thick, dark lines like you see here in some of the lines that you see in this face that we're looking at here on the left. So the hardness varies, and so they can get different kinds of effects using this graphite. Okay, just a minute. Go on. This shows you some of the differences you can achieve with graphite. This sketch that we see here is made by the same artist that I showed you earlier when I compared it to the painting that he made. And, he's used pencil, this graphite, in a very different way from the way that this artist has. He wants to describe very fine details. Again, he tends to concentrate on the face because it's a portrait that he's been commissioned to make. He actually is the one that had a lot to do with popularizing drawings in the 19th century because he was a very popular painter of portraits, and people couldn't afford, to have a painting. And so he began to make drawings, finished drawings that he would give to people who couldn't really afford to, purchase one of his paintings. And they were cheaper, but, he tried to give as much detail, particularly to the head, of the portrait as he would, in a painting. And so, here you can see him controlling the line, using probably a harder pencil for many of the lines and the drapery down here, and, really concentrating on the face. And so he gets a very exact, there's really an emphasis on line in the way that he controls the pencil in comparison to this very spontaneous sort of smudge-like effect that you have over here in this face. This is an example of chalk. This is a portrait of Leonardo da Vinci, probably made at about the end of his life. And this is red chalk. There was black, white, and red. And again, it just shows you the very fine line that you can get with an artist kind of chalk. He could describe, almost individual hairs of his beard and his hair. He could really get the wrinkles around his eyes and give us that effect of the eyes. He contrasts dark areas, such as between the lips right here versus the lighter area. And so using chalk, it was very easy for him to create a very expressive, self-portrait here of what he looked like at the end of his life. Then another kind of dry material that is used in drawing are pastels. And the term pastel in art does not mean light hues of a color. We tend to use that word to refer to, say, a pale blue, a light blue, or a pink, a lavender. We tend to use it to describe a certain tone of a hue. Pastels are actually a type of material that are used. And they probably developed because artists wanted a drawing material that could achieve the same kind of effects as an oil painting. And you really see that here in the work that you're looking at here on the left. This is the first one that's listed here. This could easily be mistaken for a painting. When you get up close to a pastel, you can always tell if it's a pastel instead of a painting because it tends to look a little soft and a little powdery. But when you're looking at it in a slide like this, we really can't tell that very well. And if you're looking at it from a distance, it's really hard to tell. Sometimes with slides that don't have proper labels on them, you can't figure out, what am I looking at? Is it a pastel? Is it an oil? Pastels are made of minerals, the same minerals that were used to make the pigments for oil painting, except instead of the pastels being placed in oil, well, they actually were put in an oil, but instead of it becoming liquid, what they allowed it to do was dry. And then the dried pigment mixed with the oil would be compressed into sticks, like a compressed charcoal is compressed into sticks, and then they use the sticks. And this one is an oil pastel. I see I have some of my information cut off here at the bottom. This is also an oil pastel over here, so you can see the different kind of effects that are possible. There's a cheaper kind of pastel also, and generally when a student starts out working with pastels, they work with the cheaper kind where the pigments are mixed with a glue instead of being mixed with an oil. But the oils are better. You can achieve more subtle, softer effects. You can get textures just like in oil painting if you use an oil pastel. But they're more expensive. So usually students start experimenting with the pastels that are made with glue. Glue or oil is the binder. It's what holds the materials together in these pastels. But again, you can get very different kinds of effects. Very spontaneous sorts of effects, as Toulouse-Lautrec achieved here with his work of this lady at the opera or at the theater. And then, very tight, very detailed kinds of effects, as in the self-portrait of the artist that you see over here on the left. Then another dry medium is crayon. And again, it's one of those materials that we tend to associate with children, but the type of crayon that artists use is a different kind of crayon again. And it is a finer kind of crayon. The pigments are mixed with wax, with a waxy sort of material, or they can also be mixed with an oil. And so when they're applied, they tend to be slightly smoother than children's crayons would be because of the materials are better that are used in order to create artist crayons. But one of the effects that even artists can have to be aware of, and that sometimes limit them so that they make other choices about the material, is when you work with a crayon, it tends to leave little lumps of color as it sort of drags over the surface, and you can't blend it very well. You can't blend it like you could blend a charcoal, or like you can blend a graphite drawing, or pastels, any of the ones that we've talked about. It can't be blended, and so you have to be aware of that, and artists are, and so artists often don't choose this kind of a medium to work with, although David Hockney is a very well-known artist that worked with it. Some artists even work with children's crayons because they want that effect, they want their art to look childlike, as if they were an untrained artist or a self-trained sort of artist. And so sometimes artists will work with children's crayons. But again, they have to be aware of the limitations if they make that choice to work in that way. Then as far as the wet media of drawing, it's ink. That is the only material that's used. And really, the differences have to do with how the ink is applied. So in other words, the technique that's used to apply the ink to a surface. And so here you see one of the techniques is to use pen and ink. And different kinds of pens have been used. All ink is carbon mixed with water. And so, in the past, quills have been used from, either porcupines or from, some kind of bird form. Grasses, reeds, have been used as the pen. And in the 19th century, metal points were developed that are called nibs, and I put that at the bottom here, N-I-B. Nibs were developed that are metal, and they can be constructed so that you can choose one nib to create a very narrow line, a very thin line. You can choose another one that'll give you a much wider, much darker sort of line. And so the type of nib that an artist chooses will cause different kinds of effects to be created in his work. Here I'm just showing you drawings that Leonardo da Vinci made. He studied not only art, he studied science. He was very interested in analyzing the human body. He studied botany, geology. He studied almost every area of knowledge at that period of time. And so I just brought in some drawings that he made using pen and ink, of the shoulder muscles and also the arm muscles, as you see here. And then he wrote about, these drawings. He wrote backwards, and so in order to read his writings in his notebooks, these drawing books, you have to use a glass, that will reverse the writing in order to be able to read them. So one technique is to use pen to apply ink. Then a technique that developed in the Far East was to use brushes in order to apply the ink. And so here we have an example from Japan of the use of the brush technique, and one particular kind of line developed using the brush technique, and that is what is called calligraphic line. And you see it being used here in the drapery. A calligraphic line starts out very thin, as you see it here, and very light, and then just by pressure of the hand on the brush, the line widens and becomes darker. And so you see that happening here as it turns this corner, it becomes darker and wider, and then it remains wide. Often in calligraphic line, they will return at the end of the line to a very thin line once more. So you start thin, you get thick, and then you go back to thin. So the Far Eastern artists, because they used the same brush and ink to write with, really became excellent artists, and you were able to manipulate the brushes very well. It's taken, Western artists longer to learn how to do this from studying, with Far Eastern artists or just studying the works themselves. Another kind of effect that also is created using the brush still is called ink washes. And with a wash, you dilute the ink with lots of water so that it's very fluid. And then you apply it broadly. And so first of all, here on the right is the work by Seishu, a very famous Zen Buddhist monk and artist in Japan. And these broad areas that you see here in the very quick way that he describes the drapery here, these are all washes. Rembrandt also used similar effects, the washes that you see up here to create a shadowed effect, also the broad strokes right in here. These are all created by using washes also. And then you also see an opposite technique in the way that Seishu described the beard and the hair. He used a dry brush. He dipped the brush into the ink, and then he wiped it until it was almost dry. When you would touch it, it would be almost dry. And then he just sort of scratched it on, to the surface to get this sort of wiry effect of the hair and the beard here and of the hair and the head here. So this really shows you how technique can affect also the different materials that are used in drawings. Okay, some new developments that have taken place. One development, of course, that's been very important is the computer. A lot of the materials and the effects that were possible using different materials like charcoal or pen or the pastels can be achieved by using a computer to do it. And so digital imagery has been one of the new developments that have taken place. And this shows you an example, one frame from a videotape that Jennifer Bartlett created. This was all created on a computer. And actually I'm going to be giving you an art project to do, and the art project is to experiment using your computers and create different kind of effects of drawing using your computers. I'll give it to you next time. So digital imagery has been one of the recent developments in drawing. Large-scale drawings, as we already talked about, because paper can be created on very large scale nowadays, whereas it couldn't be. And then another development has been, and this is really a very old idea, artists that have begun to draw on walls. Many artists have tried to show that drawings don't have to be just small, tiny little things that you have to get up really close to in order to look at. And they've tried to show that, drawings can be very large. And so this artist actually draws on the surface of the walls of the museum that he's exhibiting in. And this just shows you one example of one of the drawings that he created. He does a number of different kinds of works, not just large drawings like this, but this just shows you an example of one of the large drawings that he created. So, while we tend to think of drawings as being a very sort of traditional kind of material, there are artists today that are experimenting with how can we make it new, how can we really change, the traditional ideas about drawing. Okay, so I'm going to start talking about painting. We won't get through with it today. And start talking to you about some of the different materials that are used in painting. Many of the terms that I defined for you for drawings also apply to painting. The term support means the same thing. It's the surface that the artists are painting on. Artists have painted on paper just as drawers have made drawings on paper. They've painted on walls, wood, stones, any number of things have been used as supports for paintings. Pigment is the coloring material that, adds the color to the painter, to the paint, Binders are the things that hold the pigment together, and actually binders are very important for painting because they are really the thing that define what kind of painting you're looking at. And so I'll talk a lot about the binders. But then in addition to that, we have what is called a ground or a primer. And if you've ever painted a wall, then you have some idea about what a primer is. A primer or a ground is some sort of material. In painting, it's usually gesso, Gesso, which is it's sort of a plaster kind of material, and glue. It's something that's used to and is applied to the surface that's going to be painted on in order to prepare that surface to absorb the paint better. And sometimes it's also used to protect that surface, and we'll talk about that when we get to oil painting. Size is another term that means about the same thing as a ground or a primer. A size is often used to close up any holes in the surface, to make the surface smoother, and to prepare it, for being painted on. And then another important material that's used in painting is a solvent, because many of these paints need some way of cleaning off the brushes, and the solvents are used to do that. Also, solvents are sometimes used to thin the paint. If you want a wash sort of effect, like we saw in drawing, then the solvent will be added to thin that paint so that you can get that wash sort of effect. And again, there are different kinds of solvents used based upon the kind of binders that are used. We looked at this before, and I talked about, that the difference really between paintings and drawings are that paintings are usually more detailed, particularly in the past they were, than a drawing. And so painters are interested in giving you all the detail, really setting you in a particular time and place. They're not so interested in letting you pick the time and place. They want to give it to you. They want to describe it exactly. Another difference between drawings and paintings is that paintings are often larger. They don't have to be larger, but often paintings are much larger than drawings, particularly because in the past, you could have larger pieces of canvas or wood than you could paper, because the paper was limited in size. And so those are some of the differences between, the drawing and the painting. Now, I want to go through the materials very quickly and just, give you what the binders are that are used and some of the solvents. One of the most ancient types of materials used in painting was encaustic. And you see a mummy case here that was created in the 2nd century AD or CE in Egypt that probably represents a tradition that goes way back into the past. And what encaustic is pigment, the pigment that gives the color, that is mixed with beeswax. The beeswax is melted, and the pigment is, melted with it, and so that they become one. And then the artist has to wait until the wax dries to a certain point, and then they can begin to work with it. Wax is very permanent, and so that's why we have images like this from so long ago that were created in paint, because once they're dried, unless heat is applied to them, they really don't deteriorate. They are very good with water. They repel water, so they don't rot away. And so they were used on mummy cases, particularly in Egypt. This is painted on a wood panel. The one problem with encaustic is that you have to paint it on a very solid surface, a very stable surface, because if it's a surface that can bend, then the encaustic will crack, because it does become that very hard layer. But you can achieve all kinds of effect. You can see modeling, the shadows and the darks that are being used to model the face and make it look slightly three-dimensional, make it look naturalistic. You're able to achieve, very naturalistic sort of images using encaustic. So the binder is beeswax, and is what defines this as being an encaustic. And the only way that you can clean your brushes is to melt the wax that's being cleaned in order to clean it off. Then another kind of material, and this is the kind of material that Leonardo experimented with, is what is called fresco. And there are two kinds of fresco, and I listed them both here at the bottom. There's what's called bone fresco, which means good or fine fresco. And then there's fresco secco, which means dry fresco. And the reason that the bone, let me talk about a little bit about the materials, and that'll get us into why there are these two different names. In fresco, what the artist does is the artist paints on wet plaster, usually. And the pigments are suspended in lime water. And so when the artist applies the pigments to this wet plaster surface, a chemical bonding occurs. And so as long as the wall stands, the fresco is going to stand. And it isn't harmed very much by light or anything else. It's very permanent. The only problem with that is that you can't apply all colors in this lime water. And so here in this example, if you look over here on this side, first of all, you'll notice that the blue here looks like it's been chipping off, and up here in the sky also. Blue, the kind of blue that was used in the Renaissance period, or the beginning of the Renaissance, was made from aquamarine, which is a kind of mineral. Lapis lazuli is the material that's actually used to make aquamarine. And when it's put in lime water, it turns black. And so artists couldn't use the lime water, and they couldn't use the wet plaster, which has lime in it also. And so in that case, they had to wait until the plaster wall dried entirely and then go back in and paint the blue on. But because it's not chemically bonded, it crumbles and it flakes off. And so that was one limitation for artists that were painting frescoes. You know, they wanted their paintings to last, and yet they knew that certain pigments wouldn't last. They would flake off. So bone fresco is the term that's used to refer to the wet plaster technique, where the chemical bonding takes place between the pigments and the plaster wall. And the dry fresco, or the fresco secco, which means dry fresco, is the other technique that has to be used with certain colors. Here on this side, you can see how long it took this artist to create this work. These works are large. They're on a wall of a church. We actually saw this little chapel when we went to Italy over spring break. They're not quite life-size, but they're fairly large. And so it took this artist 9 days to paint this scene. And what he had to do each day, he would tell his assistants how much he thought he could paint in a day. And if he were painting just a background, or something, people that were less important, then he could paint them, fairly quickly. He didn't have to have a lot of detail. And so he would tell them, okay, I want you to apply this much wet plaster. And then he would wait until it dried just right. If you paint too quickly, it molds. And so they had to wait until it began to dry a little bit, and then they would begin painting on it. And at the end of the day, if they hadn't completely covered all the wet plaster with the pigment, they would simply scrape it off, and they sort of beveled the edge. And then the next day, say this artist had created this on one day, then the next day he might have said to his people, okay, I want you to put this area on. And then they would apply that area, and then he would paint it. But when it came to something like this, where he wanted lots of detail in the wool of the sheep, or with the Virgin Mary's face here, where he really wanted to spend a lot of time on that face, then he painted, very little in a day's time. The reason we know it took him 9 days is that these have been x-rayed, and you can see the joints. You can see all the joints where they had to stop at the end of a day, and then where they applied that new layer of plaster and smoothed it over just on the edge a little bit. And so that's how we know how long it took to do these. So this was the technique that was usually used for wall paintings. Well, Leonardo didn't like this technique because if you look here, you have to work quickly. If you want lots of details, or if you want lots of senses of texture, like if you want to be able to really show that this is a garment, made out of wool maybe, or, some material, and you want to show how this garment contrasts with the ground that St. Joseph here is sitting on, or how it contrasts with the body of this donkey here, you can't really do that with fresco because the fresco is drying too fast. You can only do that with oil paint because oil paint dries slowly. So Leonardo decided, well, I'm going to mix things up a little bit. And instead of using just lime plaster and pigment and lime water, I'm going to use some tempera, which we're going to talk about next, and some oil. And I'm going to try to mix that in with this fresco. And it didn't work. And so his painting started chipping off almost immediately after he painted it. Another technique, just a minute, my computer doesn't want to go, is tempera. And usually it's called egg tempera because in the Renaissance period, that's what they used as the binder. They used egg yolk. The egg yolk was mixed with the pigment, and that's what held the pigment together and what held it to the surface of the panel. Nowadays, we have tempera paint that you can buy in the store. Sometimes it's called poster paint, and it has other kinds of materials. It has glues, and it has other materials that are used as the binders. So it's not the same kind of tempera that they used in the Renaissance. And this just shows you the different steps that they went through in creating a panel using tempera. And, most of these steps would have been done by assistants of the artist, not by the artist himself. They would start out making the wood panel, and tempera has to be painted on wood once again, because when it dries, it's like egg yolk on, I don't know if any of you have ever eaten an egg in the morning and not rinsed off your dish, and you come back in the evening and you find out that egg yolk is just really stuck to the plate and it's hard to get off. Egg tempera dries very hard, and so again they have to have a very stable surface or it'll crack easily. And so they would start out making, the shape of the panel out of wood that they were going to paint on. And then B represents layers and layers of linen strips that they dipped in gesso, sort of a plaster-like substance. It's actually made of gypsum and glue. And they applied several layers of these linen strips and would smooth down each layer. And the final layer they burnished. They rubbed it until it almost looked like marble. It had almost that kind of a texture, and it was very smooth. And then on that, they would do an underdrawing, using a kind of a lead point, which is not a pencil. It's actually a very hard lead instrument that sort of sketches in, sort of cuts in the image that you're going to paint on this panel. Then where there was any place where gold was going to be put on, like on the halo here, or down here is where they actually indicate D, they would actually put sort of like a red wax on these areas, and then they would press gold leaf onto that wax sizing and create the halos. Then they would go back and they would paint the lights and the shadows using green earth, terra verde it's called, and it's actually a green pigment. So sometimes if you're in a museum and you look at some of these panels, the people look like they're ill. They look like they have this sort of greenish cast to them, and that's because the tempera has been cleaned off. It's been worn off from being cleaned so many times, and you're beginning to see that green earth coming through. And so they would do that. They would add the shadows and the lights. And then finally, after they'd done all that, then they would put the different colors on in egg tempera. Egg tempera is semi-transparent. And so the underdrawing, the green earth with the shadows and the highlights would show through the color, but it wouldn't look green. It wouldn't change the color. You just get that effect of those shadows coming through the painting. And so here, for example, is a painting that was painted using this egg tempera technique on a wood panel. This is part of a very large altarpiece in a church in Siena, Italy. And if you compare it to the frescoes, they can create a lot more details. They worked with very tiny brushes, and so they could really add all these little details in. The color really glows more. It just looks brighter. It looks more saturated. In egg tempera, where it looks rather dull in the fresco, and they use broader brushes because they're working on a larger scale, and more simpler forms. They couldn't add all those little details. So these were the two main techniques that were used in the early Renaissance period. They didn't use oil painting. Most of the paintings that were made in the 15th century in Italy were this egg tempera sort of technique or this fresco technique. But then in Flanders, in the north, oil paint developed. And I'm going to show you several different techniques that are used for this oil paint. So I think we'll stop right here for today, and we'll finish this up on Thursday.